The proceeding will start shortly.
Order. Welcome to this hearing of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, where we'll be looking at the situation in the Western Balkans. It's particularly fitting that this comes as Sunday is the 25th anniversary of the NATO involvement in Kosovo. Thank you to our three guests who've come today to give evidence. I'd be grateful if you could each introduce yourselves. Lord Robertson, do you want to kick us off?
Thank you, Chair, and it's a great pleasure to be giving evidence for only the second time, I have to say, in my career to a select committee of the House of Commons. My name is George Robertson. I was the Secretary General of NATO from 1999 to 2000 and the end of 2003, and I was the Secretary of State for Defence from 1997 to 1999 during the period of the air campaign on Kosovo. I don't think my previous parliamentary history as the Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland is particularly relevant, but it was it actually put the Balkans into perspective, I have to say.
I hope so. Ian, please.
I'm Chair. Thank you very much for having me. I'm Ian Cliff. I was Ambassador to Bosnia and Herzegovina from 2001 to 2005, and then to Kosovo from 2011 to 2015, and then more recently, or at least until 2 years ago, I was the Foreign Office research analyst on the Western Balkans.
Hi, I'm Andi, a lecturer in law at University College London. I'm an expert on the Western Balkan, and I originally come from the Western Balkan, but UK is my home for more than 20 years.
Perfect. Well, thank you all ever so much. I'd like to start with a broad question, really, for those who are less acquainted with the Western Balkans. What are the trends that we are currently seeing across the Western Balkans? These are a number of countries who are very different and diverse in terms of their peoples and their priorities. Perhaps, Dr. Hoxhaj, you might want to kick us off.
Well, the Western Balkans, at the moment, if we compare it to 20 years, have made quite a bit of progress. When it comes to the level of democracy, their engagement, in particular with the West, which is the interest of this particular committee. A number of them have open accession talks with the European Union. Much of the conversation in the Western Balkan is about joining the EU, because joining the European Union has been seen and it still is seen as the golden standard which the countries should aspire to. However, in the last 10 years, partially because the European Union is not in a position to show a roadmap and a clear roadmap when these countries could join the EU, or they could not give clear conditionalities in terms of how they can reach that particular goal, we have seen a stagnation. So democracy level and the participation has regressed in a number of the Western Balkan countries. The rule of law, some countries have made progress, but some have very much still in phases and have stagnated. And unfortunately, nationalism in some of the countries has arisen, with particularly when it comes to Serbia and Bosnia. But more specifically, we are right now in a position, particularly this year, that we could see new violence, new threats, partially because we, the West in this particular instance, are in an election year. We are here in Britain, the United States, as well as the EU, which are the three key partners, or at least that's what majority of the Western Balkan would like to view. So this will be sort of a very challenging time, but that's more or less the broader trend. But I'd be very happy to go each country specific about some of the specific challenges that they face.
Thank you. And Master Cliff, in terms of those trends, state capture, corruption, nationalism, are there any countries that are bucking the trends? Do you agree with those trends? Is there anything else you want to draw our attention to?
I think there are some countries which are moving in both directions at once, if you like. If you take a country very small, Montenegro, I think most people would say that Montenegro is the country that is closest to reaching the aspiration of joining the EU. there has been quite a lot of progress in the fight against organised crime and corruption since the big change of government 3 years ago. But at the same time, there are huge worries about Montenegro's cryptocurrency situation, and the present Prime Minister is in fact someone who was involved in cryptocurrency trading, very proud of the fact he was involved in it. And the latest EU report highlights the lack of regulation of cryptocurrency, and you have a lot of people from both Russia and Ukraine buying land on the Adriatic coast with cryptocurrency. I would also just highlight very briefly that I think Bosnia-Herzegovina faces some very particular challenges. I think Andi has alluded to the growth of some forms of destructive nationalism. Because of the structure of Bosnia-Herzegovina post-Dayton, where each of the three constituent peoples effectively has a blocking power, we see the Bosnian Serb entity, for a variety of reasons, blocking progress towards the EU and particularly towards NATO. And we also see the Bosnian Croats making huge difficulties from time to time. And I'll just add to that, I think there's been a lot of political change in Kosovo, positive political change, but still there is that threat of immediate violence, as we've seen in the last year, is particularly acute on the border between Kosovo and Serbia.
Thank you. Before we move into particularly UK interests, which I know Ranil wants to put on, Lord Robertson, is there anything you'd want to reflect on in terms of how the security climate has changed in the Balkans over the last 20 years, drawing on your experience before, but also perhaps your reflections on what might happen if we see a Trump presidency return and what that might mean for the Western Balkans?
Well, it's a big question. I think, first of all, I've got to declare interest. I'm the patron of the Labour Friends of Kosovo, which was created 2 weeks ago, and I'm also I chair a thing called the Hoxhaj group, which is the Friends of North Macedonia. So neither of them are financial interests, but they are probably quite important, and they have given me an indication of what's happening in the region as a whole. And I would sort of, in answering your question, point to the fact that the integrated review refresh is very clear that the Western Balkans are an area of concern to the United Kingdom. They say the appointment of Air Chief Marshal Lord Peach, that appointment was in recognition of its vital importance to regional stability. So the country has determined that, and I think we've got a big stake in the area, not only because we were leaders in terms of the conflict in the area, but first of all we've got the Baroness Ashton, who was the EU High Representative on foreign policy, who negotiated the Serbia-Kosovo agreement, who's a member of this House. We've got Lord Peach, again, who's a member of this House, and who is the special envoy. We've got extremely good diplomatic representation in the area, not just the previous ambassadors, but our existing ambassadors are very, very high quality indeed. We host the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London, which gives us an advantage of that. And we've also got the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, which was an organisation created way back in time. I was the first deputy chairman of the foundation, having persuaded the then Conservative government that it was a good idea to create it. And we are outside of the EU and therefore not now bound by the consensus arrangements which inhibit the European Union from doing some of the things in the Western Balkans that they should be doing at the present moment. Answering your specific question about if Donald Trump becomes president of the United States, well, that is an if, and there's no guarantee that he is going to be there, going to be president, and he can only be there for 4 more years. That's an advantage over certain authoritarian regimes like the one last weekend where a president has been elected for another 6 years on top of the 24 he's already served. If he was to undermine NATO, he can't destroy NATO and he can't withdraw the United States from NATO, then that would have an inhibition on the activities inside the Western Balkans, but it would not cripple it. The Europeans have taken on much more responsibility for the various countries in the Western Balkans, as indeed they should have done. So I see that having a minimal effect on our policy and the European policy towards an area that has in the past created a spillover of enormous consequence, destructive consequence, for the whole of the European continent.
I may bring us back to the point about the US in a moment, but Randall, please.
Thank you. Lord Robertson, you touched on it already in terms of the regional stability, and you've also detailed the past, the history that we have in the Western Balkans. What's your assessment of Britain's interest today, though, and how that they might evolve in the near future?
I think today people listen to us in the region. I was in an underground train yesterday, coming in from Paddington Station, and a lady accosted me and said, "Can I just say thank you? I'm alive today because of what you did in Kosovo in 1999." Now, it's very heartening. It doesn't happen every day, and it doesn't happen in other parts of the country, but it's heartening because we have got a stake, and a recognised stake, in the region, and therefore that allows us to say sometimes uncomfortable things to people who should be doing more than they are doing at the present moment. So if you take the situation between Serbia and Kosovo, it allows us to say things in these two countries that only friends can say about their responsibilities for adhering to the two agreements, the Brussels Agreement in 2013 and the Ohrid Agreement in 2023. So I think that gives us a degree of leverage, and also I think it means that in terms of the economic development of the region, which ultimately is going to be the only guarantee of peace and reconciliation in the region, we again have a role to play, which I think we probably underdo at the moment, but we could do much more of in the future.
Thank you. And Mr. Cliff, do you, from your experience working in the region as well, what are your observations about where the future might take Britain's interests?
Well, I have to say that if I compare my period in Kosovo and even my period in Bosnia with the present situation, obviously there is a huge difference in that we are no longer a member of the EU, and the destination for these countries, as we still say, should be membership of the European Union. So, I take what Lord Robertson says about us not being bound by the consensus rules of the EU, and that's very important in the context of Serbia, Kosovo, because one has to always bear in mind there are 5 countries in the EU that don't recognise Kosovo, and that really does hobble the EU effort. But I think we still haven't quite carved out a clear-cut view of what our role should be. We play a big role for all the reasons Lord Robertson has said. We do have, and I would add to that, I think we have particular credibility with certain political parties. It's always struck me as perhaps surprising that we actually have a lot of credibility with the Kosovo Serbs. We also have a lot of credibility, I would say, with the present Vetevendosje government in Kosovo, because we always talked to them even when they were engaged in throwing rotten bananas at people, and the Americans and the Germans didn't talk to them. So we need to leverage those links to try and get the stability that obviously is in our interest.
So on that basis, with the current settlement that we find ourselves in, to the point that Lord Robertson made earlier, how would you suggest we best pursue those objectives and actually deliver upon our own aims for that region?
I think firstly we should do perhaps a little more on trade and and the economic side, as Lord Robertson mentioned, we are the host of the EBRD. The EBRD has a Western Balkans summit in London every year, so we ought to use that. I'm always disappointed, having worked on trade promotion at various points in my career, that still British companies need a lot of encouragement to come into this region. They tend to assume it's all sewn up by the Germans and the Austrians and the Slovenes and so on. Because I think if you want to try and root out some of the corruption, having companies from countries that insist on probity it's a good way of moving your economy forward. And I still think we can do more on security. I mean, we have a lot of credibility, particularly because of the deployment of the extra 600 British troops to KFOR, but we're not in EU4 Althea in Bosnia because we chose not to ask the EU very kindly if we could stay in it when we left the EU. I think that was one of the mistakes that we made at the time of Brexit. I think we would have been welcome to stay in Althea. I think, in terms of police training for people of all ethnicities, there's a lot we can do, and we can, be a bit more consistent about our project work in the region as well. There's been a lot of backing and filling. Obviously, priorities have changed with the war in Ukraine, but we should never forget that the Western Balkans stability is very much a long-term interest of the UK.
Lord Robertson, one final question from me. Quint, is it still a credible player in the region?
The Quint is extremely important because that locks us into a diplomatic effort, which is really crucially important in the region as a whole. And I think we've got to capitalise on that as well. As Ian said, this question about leverage is the important thing. If this area is as important that the integrated review suggests, then we're going to have to pay a lot more attention to it than we have up to now. The great problem about the Western Balkans is that it very quickly spills over into other parts of the world. During the Kosovo conflict, I remember the ambassador of Switzerland, when I was appointed to be NATO Secretary General, coming and saying, we have a big interest in this. He said 40% of the people in our jail are coming from that region. So, the spillover was huge, and it's in many ways the way in which Germany abandoned its old principle about, sort of only UN helmets and not NATO helmets. They changed it because there was a degree of self-interest involved. So there is a huge self-interest in stabilising that particular region. Otherwise, it will come back and bite us.
Can I just quickly follow up on that, Lord Robertson? So can U4, though, really be, and I have to say I agree with you, Ian, about we should be rejoining U4, but can it be that effective a force when Russia maintains a veto over its extension, and also when Putin has such a close personal relationship with Dodik? Should there be a deployment specifically to Britsko district, given its sensitivities? And if we're not going to rejoin EU4, which seems to be the current government position, what can we be doing from outside of EU4 to contribute to Bosnia's stability more in terms of military projection?
Well, I think we can do that. The Foreign Secretary replied to the International Affairs Committee of the House of Lords, basically saying it can't be done and why should we do it? And it seems to me that it's self-evident that we should be doing it. And NATO has the EU has a similar concept as NATO to contributing forces. So we would have our say involved in that. And that is one of the most obvious points. But I don't think that we should take for granted the Russian connection with Republika Srpska. Because if we work on it, as Ian has said, our credibility among the Serbs is actually reasonable. Reasonable. I'm not saying it's going to be high, but first of all, we were the force that went into Kosovo and protected the Kosovo Serbs at a time when I think the Albanians might naturally have regarded as almost as revenge for what had been done to them as well. Serbia as a whole respects strength and power and recognise that we've got a lot of that as well. So I think, again, using leverage and using our diplomatic clout, we can have an effect.
And do you agree?
Yes, I think one of the things we perhaps ought to look at a bit more is trying to work with the opposition. I mean, there is an opposition in Republika Srpska. It's not very strong, and bits of it have been co-opted by Dodik and his SNSD party. But nevertheless, we should be working to create more democratic space in Republika Srpska. I mean, we have been working on media freedom. I was involved in an exercise on that just before COVID. And similarly, there is a huge problem with the Kosovo Serbs, which is all the air has been sucked out of their political system by Belgrade, by Vučić. But I think we ought to look at ways that we, with the credibility we have, can work with media outlets that aren't quite controlled by Belgrade, with NGOs that aren't controlled by Belgrade. It's difficult, and people get threatened if they work with people who are not in line with the current thinking.
Well, even
in
Christian
Belgrade.
Schmidt was threatened and told he was not allowed to come into Republika Srpska or else he'd be arrested.
Yeah. Well, they do a lot of that sort of thing. I wonder if they would really have done it, but I mean, there is an atmosphere of fear, both in Republika Srpska and among the Kosovo Serbs. And I think we ought to try and use the leverage that we have to try and counter that and to create some more space.
I think it's worth saying that the Kosovo Serbs are not really, don't have a close affinity to Belgrade. Belgrade treats them as sort of down market. But tries to own them as well. So there are opportunities there, I think, for us to insert ourselves there. I was recently asked to go on the advisory board of a new NGO that has been created in Serbia, sort of pro-Atlantic group, and I was very, very keen to do that. Any encouragement, for a pro-EU, pro-Atlantic group to be formed in Serbia seems to be well worth encouraging, and I sent a very strong message that appears on their website.
And Dr. Hoxhaj, just before we move on from the discussion on Bosnia, I'd be interested in your perception of the current way in which the Office of the High Representative is being deployed, whether you think that is a positive force at the moment within Bosnia, but also your reflections on, is it true that we can better separate Russia from Republika Srpska, or is that relationship becoming more entrenched? And then perhaps, because we're then going to move more deeply into Kosovo, the relationship between Vučić and Dodik.
Thank you for your question. Just to also pick on some of the reflection from my fellow panelists. I think the UK is not also using quite effectively the Berlin process. So the UK is part of the Berlin process, and we were the host of the Western Balkans Summit in 2018, and the UK actually is a leader on the security cluster within the Berlin process, and we take part every year in that specific summit. The Berlin process is very much led from the Home Office in the UK, so the Home Secretary is very much, that's the lead, and I think we have not used it as effectively as one could do, in addition to all of the initiatives above. When it comes to some of the other initiatives that the UK has done and can be evolved, it was positive that the British Council has returned to the Western Balkan. What I think would be worthwhile is to encourage the British Council to do the next generation report on all of the Western Balkan countries. They recently published on Albania, and it's a really interesting study and concept because it kind of sheds the light and spot the light of some of the problems that young people have in terms of their involvement in politics, their fears, and so on. So that would be really interesting to explore. On the media, I totally agree with some of the skepticism, and the media landscape across the Western Balkan is very problematic. Partially is problematic the way that it's funded, and here's where Russia comes into it, because Russia funds a lot of the space. We in here, when I mean here, the allies, so UK, EU, and so forth, have not done so well to counter all of the Russian influence in the media. We recently opened BBC service in Serbia, I think it would be wise to also open the service in Albanian language, because it could provide a different platform and it could provide a space for modern discussion and conversation to take place. When it comes to the case of Bosnia and our position there, I absolutely agree that we should rejoin, but that doesn't really seem to be the appetite. But in closing to this, what I would recommend is that we should seek the leadership in Britain to take more visit to the Western Balkans and to be more proactive and engaging. So we had last year the Prime Minister of Albania, and it was the first government hosted a PM in 100 years, and the last of a current head of government from the Balkans in more than a decade. Mm-hmm. And in addition, we haven't seen a UK Prime Minister visiting the Balkans in a really long time. It's all positive that we have a special envoy, but having that would really send a powerful message in terms of improving our influence in the Balkans and pushing for more of the leverage. And on a final point, we are home to many of the diaspora communities from the Western Balkans, and we don't do enough to engage the diaspora community that is actually here in London, that can be a really powerful voice in terms of facilitating a more positive discussion, as well as increasing our influence in the region.
Very helpful, thank you. Fabian.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Hoxhaj, could I come to you first with this next question? What do you think are the prospects for a normalisation of relations between Kosovo and Serbia occurring any time soon?
Thank you for your question. I don't necessarily view that in this particular calendaric year we will see any progress. Partially is because we are in an election year across the world, and I cannot see an appetite for that to move forward. But what is more important for us to discuss is what has the EU-led dialogue achieved? And in the last 5 years, I should put it, of the current Commission, we haven't really seen a positive development. Yes, we have seen some technical issues being dealt and some technical issues being set out, but the substance hasn't really sorted out. And that is because there are a lack of initiatives, there are a lack of incentives. Because what we are promising them, we are promising, in a nutshell, a lot of investment if they de facto recognize one another, and somehow they should move forward. In the case of Serbia, they've done many ties and links with China, Russia, and so on, so they don't really need our money. Of course, they use the EU money to build a lot. But what we should come clear, and perhaps this is what the UK could do, it's with NATO countries that don't recognize Kosovo, to have an honest discussion with them whether they would recognize Kosovo, and if so, by when. Because what is the incentive for Kosovo to move forward if you are just merely offering a de facto recognition? So this is the bigger question, and this is actually the elephant in the room, because these countries, by not recognizing Kosovo or by not coming up with a specific timeline when this would happen, it's preventing Kosovo for integrating in all of the international community and also coming in good faith. Because if you want to have a positive dialogue, you have to be in a good faith. At the moment, I cannot see the current dialogue being in good faith as long as these countries are not clear when it comes to their recognition. Then on the final point in terms of the dialogue, unfortunately, the dialogue is turned at the moment a sort of internal politic debate, and is used at times to suppress civil society, opposition, and so on, if they sort of question the leader that leads this dialogue. And the efforts on the dialogue should go beyond the leadership, because this should be a reconciliation process, and the ultimate goal should be mutual recognition, which will allow both of these countries to move forward. Without having those guarantees, I think we're going to waste more time, and unfortunately, the evidence is there where 37% of the population in the Western Balkans has already left the Western Balkans. If we go with the current trend, by 2030, nearly half of the Western Balkan population will be living abroad, and by 2040, more than 60% will be living abroad and not in the Western Balkan. And then, can we sit here honestly and say, well, we achieved something? So that's why this is a matter of urgency.
Let me turn to you next, Lord Robertson, and it's always good to see you. Why do you think it's in the UK's interests to support ongoing negotiations between Serbia, Kosovo and the EU? And what tools do you think the British government might use to do this? Can I come to you first and then to Mr. Cliff, Lord Robertson?
Yeah, it's in the country's interest because we've declared that the stability of the Western Balkans is important, generally. I think there is this question of spillover and the fact that the Russians and the Chinese and others are using the Western Balkans as a sort of adventure playground while our attention is diverted elsewhere. And it is because we have a degree of leverage that other countries don't have, because of the goodwill that we have produced in the region. I was there last year, and I know just how warmly the older generation feel about our role 25 years ago in what we did at that time. And I think that gives us a degree of influence that other people may not have, and we should use as well. If you read Cathy Ashton's book, and then what I think it's called. I meant to bring my copy along with me today, but she describes in granular detail the negotiations that took place in order to get to the agreements that she was responsible for. They're painful, and those of us who've been involved in international negotiations know just how painful a lot of these detailed negotiations can actually be, but it provided a foundation for progress to take place. And although our academic colleague sort of says it's very difficult to see, and it's all bound up with local politics, and perish the thought we would never allow international events to be the casualty of domestic politics, would we? You can still insert yourself into that, and when Prime Minister Kurti was over here a fortnight ago, it was an opportunity for the government to express a view to him, as some of us outside of government did. There's a parliamentary delegation from Kosovo in the palace at the present moment. In fact, they're appearing before the International Affairs Committee of the House of Lords tomorrow, when I will be temporarily in the chair. So we've got opportunities for making a point of view known. And I think that it is so much in our interests that the Western Balkans are stabilised, become a normal part of mainstream Europe, and therefore safeguarding our security and our prosperity at the same time.
Thank you. Mr. Cliff, your thoughts?
I would agree with all of that. I think, when we look at the situation that erupted in the 1990s, we suffered because of the flow of refugees, because, frankly, in Bosnia-Herzegovina there was a perception we were an obstacle to what was called lift and strike, the lifting of the arms embargo on the Bosnian Muslims and the allowing airstrikes against Serb positions. So I think, because the stability of Europe is in our interest, the stability of the Balkans is in our interest. It's also in our interest to counter the influence of sort of nefarious elements. I think I mentioned that before. Russia, also China in many ways, also coming out of Saudi Arabia and some other Middle Eastern countries, some radical forms of Islam, which I think is a worry among particularly Bosniak communities, not just in Bosnia. So what can we do about it? Well, I think that we need to perhaps leverage a bit more those links that Lord Robertson's been talking about. We do have a lot of credibility, and we can help push the negotiations forward. I would agree that in recent months, perhaps, because it's an EU-led process and we're not in the EU, we have been pushed a little bit to one side. But I think we should use the fact we're in the Quint, to make sure that we understand what's going on and that we can support it. And I'm a little bit more optimistic than perhaps Andi is about the prospects for an eventual solution. I think it's like a lot of things. When the time is right, there is a possibility of reaching some sort of normalisation between Serbia and Kosovo. A lot of it will depend on what Mr. Vučić sees as being in his interests. I wouldn't for a moment suggest I can see into Mr. Vučić's head, but he's a great one for playing different elements off against one another. I don't think one should assume that he is forever a plaything of Putin and Moscow. The relationship is more complex than that, and he may at some point see it as in his interest to move in an EU direction rather than a Moscow direction.
Thank you, Mr. Kofi. I mean, your answer's conveniently taken me to the next question, which we partly touched already, and that is, do you think that the UK has deprioritised or moved away from the Western Balkans as a region of engagement since we left the European Union? I know you've already touched on that, but do you want to elaborate a little bit? And then perhaps we can ask Lord Robertson and Dr. Hoxhaj.
To be honest, I think we have a bit. I think there have been other priorities, including Brexit itself, consuming a lot of the energy around Whitehall. But I think we've made a conscious effort not to lose sight of the region, and I think Andi Hoxhaj made a very important point that we hosted the Berlin Process Summit in 2018. We've tried to keep in that process, even though we're not in the EU. But I think yes, inevitably, with the situation that we now face with Russia and Ukraine, the questions in Gaza, it probably doesn't have the priority that someone like me, who's a dyed-in-the-wool Balkanist, would like to see.
Lord Robertson.
I think undoubtedly we've deprioritised, and I think that is regrettable. I direct the attention of the committee to the reply that was given to the International Affairs Committee of the House of Lords. We did a short inquiry, but we did it in some detail, and we gave a lot of attention to some of the issues that had derived from our previous report, and that's the reply from the Foreign Secretary. Brief and not terribly informative. So I think if you want evidence about the deprioritisation, I'm afraid that is that, despite the fact that the EU Foreign Secretary had actually been to Kosovo on the 4th of January. So he felt it a priority, but we didn't get a substantive argument back here as well. But, I draw attention to what Dr. Hoxhaj said in his last contribution, that by 2040, 60% of the Western Balkans population will have left. And where are they going to be? They're going to be here. They're going to be in Western Europe, not going to Russia, they're not going to China, they're not going to Africa, they're here. So if migration is a big issue in this country, and it will continue to be and growing so, here's one of the reasons why we're beginning to see it. The lady on the tube yesterday who greeted me with affection is not the only Kosovar or Bosnian who's around in our capital city here today. So these demographic statistics, should be something we focus on.
Dr.
Undoubtedly, we have deprioritized the Western Balkan, but partially is because since we left the European Union, much of our Balkan policy was tied into it. However, in the last 2 years, I've seen some positive development when it comes to our engagement, but primarily it's in the space of the rule of law, partially because we have seen the Western Balkan route, particularly used by organized crime and migration, to come to West Europe as a problem. And our engagement has been in that space. The recent agreement that we have seen in the UK, it's the National Crime Agency and the Albanian anti-corruption structured, and that is primarily to target organized crime networks that operate from the Western Balkans in the UK and in Albania to sort of disrupt some of those links. But politically speaking, we could do more, and hosting another Western Balkan summit in the back of what we did in 2018 would not be such a bad idea to re-establish and reassert ourselves, but I suppose that will not happen until we have our own election.
Thank you.
Henry.
Thank you. Lord Robertson, what do you think should be the UK's policy objectives and priorities when it comes to Kosovo?
Well, it should be reconciliation between the two elements in Kosovo, and it should be helping to grow the economy. You know, I think it's almost self-evident that prosperous societies tend not to be problematic societies as well. And I think, you know, trade and industry are areas where, you know, we've got some strengths and we could deploy them to the area. But as Dr. Hoxhaj says, in terms of organised crime, you know, one of the instruments that Russia uses, and if it succeeds in Ukraine will use even more, is the encouragement of organised crime rings. And I've got a very vivid memory, which I use regularly when I'm in the region, is of a man called Goran Svilanovic, who was the first post-Milosevic foreign minister of Yugoslavia, who stood at NATO headquarters at the point de presse that we held there. And he said to the press, he said, "Can you imagine, ladies and gentlemen, how prosperous the Balkans would be today if we politicians had the same degree of inter-ethnic cooperation as the criminals?" And I think in a way that sums up so much of what's happening in the Balkans. So focusing a little bit on the corruption and the criminality, which is encouraged by outside players, and helping with the industrial development of the region, I think is going to be an important way in which we can bring about the reconciliation, particularly in Kosovo and Serbia, but in the wider region as well.
Thank you. Dr. Hoxhaj, how do you feel the elections in December last year have emboldened Vucic's nationalist agenda and cause?
Well, the nationalist agenda was even before the election, but however the turnout event of the election have further embodied his nationalist agenda, partially because we saw quite openly how the elections in most part of Serbia were interrupted. We have seen allegation of election frauds, and we have seen a lot of protests in the capital city, and at the moment we have seen that they're going to rethink to hold election in that space. So that's an element, but Vucic in particular, he uses that nationalist card, particularly when he's weak at home, when he can see that, because if someone is comfortable in its skin, he will not intervene in the election. And as you saw, and we all saw over the weekend, the soldier entering the polls in Russia, we have seen similar things also in the Western Balkans, and particularly in Serbia, but maybe not to that extent. So if someone is that comfortable, will not be doing that. The problem that we have at the moment is we cannot predict what Vucic is going to do next, and we should not underestimate what happened in northern part of Kosovo, that Vucic and his cronies were not held accountable and still are not being held accountable for what happened. It became quite clear that the person who was behind, he is still in Belgrade, he's still walking free, and the recent report we saw that one of his companies that owns Share received 8.5 million euros after the attack. So that is a quite clear evidence, and what is appalling and what is worrying is that we are not calling this out, and if we allow this to go unaccountable for, then I'm afraid we will not see a very bright 2024. I wish I can be more optimistic, but we have to be truthful to some of the conditions which we are operating.
Thank you. If I could turn to you just as an add-on to that question, Mr. Cliff, with regard to the election irregularities and that calling out of the way that those irregularities have come about and haven't been checked. What can the UK do to help to help call that out, to help expose that? And do we have any particular leverage in Serbia to be able to do that?
Well, we actually have the BBC Serbian website, which it's a web version of BBC World Service, but it's interesting how not very many people really looked at it to start with. Then during the COVID pandemic, suddenly people started looking at the BBC because they got more accurate information from the BBC than they did from anyone else. And that's continued as we've seen the protests against election fraud in Belgrade. I mean, what can the UK do on its own? Probably it is a bit limited. As I say, I think we can work with more outward-looking elements in all these countries to strengthen their hand, but it's not very easy when you have an autocratic system supporting the existing government. But also, we are a member of the OSCE. The OSCE observes the elections, ODIHR, and it's not the question you've asked me, but let's think later this year there will be elections in Kosovo. I'm assuming that in the Serb majority areas we will again have election fraud, busing of people in support of Srpska lista. I think we should be encouraging the OSCE and the other election observation missions to call that out. There's been a tendency to sort of push it into the background.
Apart from providing information, for example, via the BBC website, should we be going much further? Sanctions, for example, other measures like that?
We have got sanctions against certain individuals. Mr. Radojcic, who has admitted that he was behind the Banska incident, is subject to sanctions. Dodik, of course, is subject to sanctions. It is a method of registering our displeasure and in some cases putting people in difficulties. It just depends whether they've got money in London, just how much it pinches. But I don't think, for example, if you're asking should we be putting full-scale trade sanctions on Serbia, then I think the answer is no. I mean, in fact, that would be cutting off our nose to spite our face because, we are trying to build up our trade for all the reasons that we discussed earlier. So I don't think that would be a particularly productive way forward. And going back to a question that was asked earlier, I don't think Vučić is forever in the hands of Putin, and I'm not even sure that Dodik is. I mean, I remember the days when Dodik was the darling of the West, the man who stood up to Karadzic. These guys, they see where their interests lie, and they can flip-flop. I think it's a bit unlikely that Dodik is going to suddenly attach himself to the West, but you never know.
So on that point, I started, final question, Chair, if I may. I started, Lord Robertson, by asking you about what British foreign policy objectives and priorities should be towards Kosovo. If I were to ask that question, what our priorities and objectives should be towards Belgrade, do you think we should be a little tougher? Do you think we should take on board the fact that we shouldn't necessarily accept the narrative that they're in the pockets of Moscow?
No, we should not assume that, but we should assume that there is going to be influence on them. But maybe a bit more attention by us would repay the effort, as Ian has said. They watch the way the wind is blowing, they can't have been terribly impressed by the lack of success by Putin in his adventure into Ukraine, and therefore there might be opportunities then for us to sort of pay a little bit more attention, to what they're saying. The Kosovo campaign, as you say, was 25 years ago, but it showed the Serbs that we were serious and that we were interested. They resented it, and they still make a lot of mileage out of some of the damage that was done during the air campaign. But I went to speak at the General Staff College in Belgrade in my last days in NATO, and you couldn't help but feel the degree of respect that there was from basically a defeated military at that time, but one who respected the fact that they were up against some degree of strength. So given that they're transactional in the way they do things, I think a bit more attention paid there, and especially on the defence side, might repay quite a bit of goodwill.
Can I just quickly ask about that point around elections in Serbia? So we saw a great number of public protesters out in the streets, bravely fighting against a lot of the restrictions on freedom of speech. We do have an opposition in Serbia who are very pro-EU, who are pro-democracy, but OSCE has been incredibly critical of the elections that took place in December. There were reports of Bosnian Serbs being bussed into Belgrade to take part in the elections. There were also reports of Serbs from across Serbia being bussed into Belgrade for where there weren't municipal elections taking place in those parts of Serbia. Are those reports credible? And is one of the solutions on the 2nd of June, if there's a rerun of the election, that they should all be municipalities across the whole of Serbia to reduce this busing, or is that not a viable response? Whoever wants to take that. Well, Dr. Hoxhaj.
Thank you for the question. I kind of want to link them both in a way. We should not underestimate Russia's influence at all in any case, because Serbia has reduced its alignment with the EU foreign policy when it comes to sanctions against Serbia in the last 2 years. So before it used to be 50 to 54%, now it's less than 50%. So we have to look at the statistic rather than what they say. On the specific point on the election, the reports are quite credible, and what we saw was the Freedom House reporter that sort of reports about the level of democracy in Serbia was actually called out by name by Vučić being sort of a sponsor, and he was quite openly citing some of these misconduct. And what was really frightening in this specific case is that the report will come out in 11th of April, and the president of Serbia was actually calling the name of the author, which is supposedly to be anonymous, 2 weeks before, partially because they were calling out the name. So it's quite frightening in a way that any critical voices is being suppressed. And we as the UK, but also the collective alliance of NATO and EU, should support critical voices when they deal and when they call out such acts. And our role within the OSCE should be strengthened, because we sometimes, as a collective alliance, we underestimate our role in some of these institutions. So I've seen the OSCE give recommendation about the electoral reform across the Western Balkans, but always are very cosmetic. We never truly talk about substantial reform. One way that we can reduce this sort of autocracy in the Western Balkans is to have term limits. And we can use our institutions and our efforts and our influence within these institutions to put these sort of conditionalities. Of course, it might be viewed that we are sort of influencing from the outside, but if we are using the conditionality system, that does not prevent us for asking to have fixed term elections in some of these countries, and it will allow for different elites to circulate, because at the moment across the Western Balkans we have leaders that have been there in the last 30 years. I've been grown up, being a baby and still now giving evidence in Parliament, seeing these figures. So, but that's something that we can do, and we should not underestimate at all our influence that we have in these institutions.
Thank you. Ranil.
Thank you. We've kept touching on Russia through your evidence. Lord Robertson, how seriously should NATO take the threat of Serbia's increasingly close military-industrial ties with Russia?
Well, we should take all of these things very, very seriously. Indeed, I'm not sure whether at the moment Russia has got the capacity to do very much in that connection. But you know, they're there, and they're influential. And you know, one of the weaknesses we have in the West is that the weaponry that we produce is so sophisticated we can't share the technology, and so expensive nobody can afford to buy it. And it's one of the reasons why the global South seems to be offside in terms of what's happening in Ukraine, because they depend on Russia and China for getting very quick, cheap military equipment, and we should really bear that in mind. But the other thing is that in terms of Russian influence in the region and Chinese influence in the region, is that, you know, getting a message over, getting signals over of our interest and our involvement in the region is very important. You know, there is no BBC Albanian service, and that was one of the recommendations dismissed by the Foreign Office in their reply to the House of Lords. And we're not doing nearly enough. During the Cold War, we had a massive operation going on. The BBC World Service, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe. You know, we stretched ourselves to the very limit to break down the hegemony of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. We seem to have given that up now. You know, in the British Council and in the BBC World Service, we've got two of the agencies owned and controlled by this country that have got massive reach and huge influence, especially in these regions where people are desperate for accurate information. And now you can multiply their effect by social media, because the internet is not controlled in the way that the print media and the television media is as well. And so the question really is, are we doing nearly enough to get over our message about democratic values and about the way in which people in that region and other regions are being robbed? And I think, you know, that's an area where we could, without expending huge amounts of extra money, be able to do much more.
And so in terms of your assessment of what we are doing, would it be fair to say that the appeasement of Serbia does not in any way appear to draw it away from its ties with Russia?
I wouldn't use the word appeasement. I think that's a bit of a loaded expression. But you know, we're too relaxed about the way in which they're reaching out to Russia, and a little bit more energy devoted to splitting them away would not be a very bad idea.
And Dr. Hoxhaj, could you just, for the record, so that it's taken as part of our evidence, I've got my own views on this, it'd be very good to get your views as to why you would contend Russia is exploiting Serbia and Kosovan sovereignty, and whether also this is just another proxy for Russia against the West.
Well, thank you for the question. Again, undoubtedly, Russia has a huge influence in the Western Balkans, and it's not shy away from it. We have sort of focused mostly on Serbia and Kosovo for the purpose of this committee, but Russia has a massive influence across, and we as the West underestimate their effort, and we don't fully recognize as well as acknowledge. Just think about in other parts of the Western Balkans where we think that we have a lot of average, like Albania, North Macedonia, and so on, because the UK and US has sanctioned a number of politicians and individuals in these countries. Russia has used that sort of information to amplify the war against the West. And if you look at the moment across the Western Balkans, quite a lot of the support for the West has dropped because Russian influence, particularly in the space of the media, has used that against the West. Absolutely, Russia wants to use the Western Balkans as a proxy war. Primarily, they want to destabilize the region, and that's partially to move our efforts away at the moment in Ukraine. I think we should keep our focus on the Western Balkans. This is a really positive discussion today because we are shedding some light, but more has to be done because we seem to be losing that. In terms of what we can do to counter that, well, what I want to add is Russia gives a lot of scholarships and works a lot on the culture element and education space in the Western Balkans. Just to give you an example, prior to the war in Ukraine, Russia in Albania, which is a NATO member, gave 50 scholarships, whereas we with Achieving Scholarship only gave 4, as well as the Fulbright of the US also gave 4. So, with our massive GDP, and that's a massive influence that Russia could employ, because if you have 50 people, you educate them and you ensure when they come back they get really good and important jobs within the administration. That is influence, and you are buying influence. And we are not doing enough of that. I'm quite hopeful that the Achieving Scholarship for the Western Balkans has expanded in the last 2 years from the last time that I gave evidence, and now we have also opened a new Achieving in the space of cybersecurity, and that's something that we can do. And on the last point, on the sort of appeasement element, I think we should be more strong and call it out, because we are not constrained anymore through the EU dialogue. And if we see that it's something not within our values, we should call that out, and we should engage more with other actors as well, not just purely with the government, because that way we can also get more support on the ground from different actors.
Henry.
Thank you. What is your take on reports in the last few days of a new agreement or an updated agreement between Russia and Serbia, and some of the comments I think that Vučić has said off the back of that, emboldening sort of nationalist speak against Kosovo? I don't know who might want to go with that.
Well, on the new sort of agreement, I don't know the ins and out of the agreement, because usually any agreement between Putin and Vučić is non-transparent, and unfortunately with any sort of autocrat we mostly learn them by the international media. But in terms of the way I see it, I see that Vučić is again not being shy with its ties with Russia, and it's quite clearly showing its commitment to the Serbian and Russian relation. For us, we should take this very seriously. We should not underestimate any of the new agreement. I think we have underestimated, even in the light of the war in Ukraine, where Russia and Serbia, on the fringes of the UN General Assembly in New York, they signed an agreement on cooperation on political matters, and we didn't see any response whatsoever in the West. But the way that I sort of view this agreement is Vučić is in a bad place because of the alleged election fraud in Serbia, and would like to have some sort of support, and is using this sort of new agreement to put new threats towards the West. The problem is that he will exploit this. Partially it's because we cannot make any decision-making process, partially because we are in an election year. The EU is in an election year, and most likely will have a new sort of envoy when it comes to Serbia and Kosovo after the May election. But that would be something to watch, and we should really be careful.
Do you think it signals some insecurity?
There are insecurities, but also it's more or less to threaten more the West, that we don't care. We are going to stick to our strongest ally.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just briefly before we move on to discussing the Banska attack in more detail, there are lots of reports that essentially the north of Kosovo has been captured by criminal elements, whether it be crypto factories, cannabis factories, weapons stores being found, obviously Srpska Lista and the way that things are run there. Is that a fair assessment, and is this sanctioned by Belgrade? Mr. Cliff, I don't know if you want to kick us off.
I think it's a very fair assessment. I mean, what we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years is every voice in North Kosovo that diverged from what Belgrade wanted has gradually been either silenced. We had the assassination of Oliver Ivanovic, which still hasn't been, there's been no light shed on that. Of course, Mr. Radojcic, who was behind the Banska incident, was at one time indicted in connection with the murder of Ivanovic, but that's been pushed back. I mean, it hasn't been pursued. Either people have been eliminated or they've been co-opted. And it is very, very difficult for NGOs, for example, who want to reach out to Pristina or to Western embassies to do so, because then the members of those NGOs find that their families are threatened, sometimes quite subtly. You know, auntie loses her job as a cleaner in a school. It's not always the sort of heavy kind of pressure, but sometimes it is. That's why I say that I think we ought to be looking at ways of trying to reopen the political space among the Kosovo Serbs, because there was a time when there were different political streams, and I think we should try and get back to that.
Can I push you on that? So how do we do that? Because there are reports, as you say, people losing their jobs, people finding a grenade on their doorstep when it looks like they worked with the Kosovan police rather than just relying on the kind of local militia police. How do we genuinely open up a space where the vast majority of Kosovo Serbs who are peaceful, law-abiding but living in a state of fear, that they do have that space?
Well, it is difficult, but I think there are ways of working with people behind the scenes. I mean, I know there are contacts that take place, but they're not publicised precisely because of the threat to people's families. And there are one or two projects which we can support in Mitrovica, which is the meeting point between the two. I don't think we should give up, because I think there has been a tendency to give up on the grounds that the way to a settlement of the problems of the Kosovo Serbs or northern Kosovo lies through Belgrade. But time and again, we've seen Belgrade doesn't deliver. I do think that we need to work on that and work with our EU partners. And by the way, I do think the EU has been extremely bad at getting its message across about the degree of support it gives to economic development, young people and so on, because certainly if you ask anyone in Serbia itself or among the Kosovo Serbs or the Bosnian Serbs, they have a completely lopsided vision of how much support they get from Russia and how much support they get from the EU.
That's really helpful. And then, Dr. Hoxhaj, just to set the context, because we often talk about Vucic's ambitions for Kosovo as if they're absolute. And I wonder if there is some nuance that perhaps we don't understand when we look at it from London, because, for example, there are warning, and we often talk about how autocrats tell us what they're going to do next, and too often in the West we ignore them and hope that that's not really true. They're not going to do what they tell us. But, for example, President Vucic said in a speech before the election that Serbia should learn from Azerbaijan's example in its conflict with Armenia, where they waited 28 years for a special geopolitical circumstance. Now, you can take from that what you will, and I'll ask you for your comment. Yesterday, Vucic said that the West must choose between Serbia and Kosovo, and if they choose Kosovo, that Serbia will wait for the best possible momentum, and then we will seize our opportunity. So how serious are these ambitions, or are they really just a play to a domestic interest to assure re-election?
They are both. So primarily it is for the internal audience, and primarily it's to keep them at bay, and primarily it's to bring in the Kosovo card, as they call it, within Serbia, to keep his base tight. However, his ambitions are actually to have that influence. His ambitions are to keep instability. He has not been a good faith partner when it comes to the negotiation process. He has used Serbs in Kosovo to incite violence, and they are not living quite well in that specific space. So his ambitions are quite clear when it comes to destabilization. Now, what we can do in this specific space, first is we have to take him serious. We cannot continue with this sort of appeasement because somehow he might change heart and he might come close to the West, where we see example after examples and after the examples are not being held accountable. Now, with any autocrat, it's difficult to predict what they're going to do next, but the fact that we have not taken accountability measure towards Vučić that has emboldened him to push further for this agenda. Here, particularly when we talk about the northern part of Kosovo, Kosovo has agreed that it's a multicultural state. It has tried to include them within the institution. It should allow its ethnic minorities within Kosovo to be part of the Kosovo institution. By law, that has been the space. Politically, it has tried. However, more efforts have to be done to include them fairly, but without the interference of Vučić, because at the moment, Vučić used them as an instrument to sabotage any of the government institution and structure in Kosovo and use them to sort of delay any of the debate and so on. So from the UK perspective, we should take that very seriously, but more importantly, we should also make our allies to see that very, very seriously, because at the moment we are seeing the EU is not taking Vučić and his efforts very seriously, and we have seen all of the steps that they have done in the last year. And I'm afraid if we continue this path, it will embolden him even further.
Thank you. And Mr. Cliff, we hear a lot of criticism from the EU and the US, but notably not from the UK, that Kurti is an unreliable partner, or that Kurti is not listening, Kurti isn't engaging in the process. There seems to be a lot of personal feeling in those descriptions, because when you ask for a meaningful breakdown of what hasn't been delivered, they struggle so much to deliver that long list. So can you tell me where perhaps the relationship is broken down between the Kosovan government and the EU and the US?
I think if you take the US, the US have always been rather suspicious of Albin Kurti. I think there was this idea in the period just after independence that Kurti was really in favour of union with Albania because of one or two things that he said in that direction. There was this whole idea that he was a socialist who didn't want to pursue privatisation. And although I think things have changed a lot, you're quite right. You do get this message from the Americans a lot of the time. And of course the Americans were instrumental in heaving him out the first time he was Prime Minister by putting pressure on the LDK to pull the plug on that coalition government. With the EU, I think it's more nuanced, but I think Albin Kurti would, portray himself as a conviction politician. He's sometimes rather literal, which is how we got to this slightly absurd situation where we've got 4 Albanian mayors in the north. But I think, also we're beginning to see some other elements of Albin Kurti's realism, particularly with regard to his latest pronouncement that the Constitutional Court decision on the Dečani land dispute, which sounds very obscure but which is very important for the Serbian Orthodox Church, that decision from 2016 should be implemented. He's only done it because he's now able to say that's our route into the Council of Europe. But that gives the lie to this argument that you can't deal with him. And I think one of the reasons we've given him a lot of space is that he has really tried to fight corruption and to end the state capture by the PDK largely that existed before. And curiously, I always found, even when I was in Kosovo, that the Americans and even the Germans didn't quite see the way in which the other parties really had captured all the supposedly independent institutions. But it's something where I think we, you say, what can we do? I think we can work on our partners to have a bit more trust in the present government, while putting pressure on it over issues like the Association of Serb Majority Municipalities, which is something we haven't mentioned so far this afternoon, rather to my surprise.
Well, feel free to draw that in. I'm going to move us to the Banska attack because I think it's quite a decisive moment in terms of the last year of increasing tensions. Lord Robertson, you are most certainly a military man. That would be to diminish just your experience. But we are led to believe by some that a disparate group broke into northern Kosovo, murdered a Kosovan police officer, and it was a lonely group acting of their own volition. But they had access to rather serious and high-level equipment, mortar shells, armoured trucks, grenades, anti-tank mines, some of them as new as 2021, so this isn't old Yugoslav kit, many with the serial numbers lining up, suggesting that they've come as a group. Is that a credible position for some people to follow?
No, I think Dr. Hoxhaj has already mentioned the fact that the evidence is pointing in a very clear and certain direction, and not a lot has been done about it up to now, but it probably needs to be done, and somebody needs to be held to account for it. The police officers died in the process of theirs. It's not a victimless crime, and I think a lot needs to be done about it. And it brought in, the British forces brought in 600 extra people at that time. So the destabilisation of the country was very considerable at that time.
And before we move on to that, Dr. Hoxhaj, therefore, how complicit is it assessed that the Serbian government is in what happened in Banska?
Well, the evidence points towards them being quite closely linked to it, because the very fact that they have normalized the situation, where after the attack they welcomed them home and called a number of them as heroes, that does show you that they have normalized and they are complicit. The fact that the state of Serbia has allocated and given 8.5 million euros for an unspecified arrangement or suspected purchase, does show you that it's a handsome pay that they made to a company linked to Milan Radovic, that it's behind it. So the evidence point there, but so far we have not seen the investigation or an investigation that has been done. Kosovo has conducted its own investigation, and the US as well as the UK has believed that it's a credible investigation done by the Kosovo authorities, but we have not had the international communities actually confirming that. We had the Secretary of State that came earlier to this committee that actually acknowledged that there are serious problem and issue here that might link them there. But that has to be learned. A lesson has to be learned from this attack, and we have to call it what it is, because we need to prevent any potential threat. Because if we let this unaccount for, then who knows what might happen this year.
Forgive me, we are now 6 months on from the Banska attack, so why do you think there is such silence, particularly when it doesn't look like, for example, you might want to argue that the Serbian regime is changing some of its behaviours and therefore it's important to perhaps hold back an investigation in order to see that change manifest. But as per the statements I shared that the Serbian president has made recently, as per the extreme electoral dysfunction that was the election that he held in December, there doesn't seem to be any sort of mitigation of the worst excesses of his behaviours, whether it be at home or abroad. So why is the international community silent?
Well, that's a really good question, and the problem here that I see is we have the Interpol has issued an arrest warrant for the perpetrators behind, and why the Serbian authority are not implementing that Interpol. And the very fact that the international community is not calling it out because it's hoping that somehow Vučić will sit down and sign an agreement that they made 1 year ago, and somehow we will see that being implemented. Now, of course, there is a number of interest across the EU for this to happen before the election, because then it can be sold in the internal election as some sort of a success, as we saw last time with the Trump presidency, where they sat down with the Prime Minister of Kosovo and President, and they used that in the election. So this is my hunch why they are not calling it out. But this is only going to make the problem worse, because if we are allowing this to be unaccounted for, who knows what's going to happen next. And Vučić very openly is alluding to another confrontation.
Mr. Cliff, what do you think we should be doing in response?
Well, one thing I think we should be doing is asking our friends in the EU what they've done with the Kosovo government report, because as I understand it, the report was handed over to Brussels in January. Here we are in the middle of March. What are they doing about it? I mean, I haven't seen that report, but I presume that we've got it. But I think we should be taking a very firm line. I mean, Radojcic, who admits he did it, he had his passport taken away, but we're not sure it hasn't been given back to him. He's supposed to be subject to some sort of legal process in Serbia, but it's put off and put off. So I think we should be asking some questions about that.
Would you be surprised if you were told that the US had done an investigation that's been presented to NATO?
Yeah, I hadn't heard that.
And that again, has still not been presented to the world in any way, shape or form. So what's the lesson then that Serbia will take from the fact that we have what looks to be a state-sponsored terror attack on a neighbouring country, no response from the international community, silence, no investigations being published? What does that say for deterrence in the Western Balkans, an area that, as Lord Robertson said, quickly spills over into others?
The lesson is that you do things in election year. Unfortunately, that's the lesson that they will derive from that. You know, it may be that after the elections have taken place, people might be more re-energized, but the cynic would say you do it when there are elections looming, and people will sort of put it to the side, hopefully temporarily.
And Dr. Hoxhaj, do you agree with that? But also, this is a pattern of increasing. So, I mean, maybe we're overplaying Banska in this discussion. I mean, we have had, electoral foreign interference in Kosovan elections. Then we had the mayors being imposed. Then we had malicious attacks on NATO soldiers who lost their legs and will never walk again. Then we had the kidnapping of police officers by Serbian forces. And then we had Banska. Are we overplaying it? Is this just a pattern of normalised activity that's taking place?
Well, the US has said that they have done an investigation, and from what we read in an article that the security advisor to the president has said that they are quite serious and they're going to use that for their negotiation with Serbia. It would be good to have more transparency there.
It's Jake O'Sullivan you're talking about there, yes.
But when it comes to, we are not sort of, in this very committee, we are putting here a trend, and we are kind of explaining Vucic's behavior towards Kosovo, but his aggression across the Western Balkans, because it's not only Kosovo. So by not calling out some of these patterns, we are emboldening them, and we are sort of allowing for this space to happen. We are also allowing for them to threaten with instability in the region. But in addition to, because the Banska attack, it's very much visible and we all saw it, but as you alluded, we have seen it, election interference, we have seen a widespread of disinformation and misinformation. In fact, even from the Balkan, they're having an impact in our own Western election. And we still have not called out a number of them. For example, in 2016 in the US. And we are entering an election years, and I think we should also be quite alert for any disinformation campaign that might begin from the Western Balkans. But the lesson that we can learn from this is we have to call them out at an earlier stage, and not hoping that some of these autocrats eventually will become European, because they've been around for a very long time, and I cannot see them changing behavior, because Vucic has been in power for more than 10 years. And why on earth will he change his behavior now, where he's quite clearly showing hostility?
And can I push you on that point there? Because you do hear a lot of people say, let's not push Vucic too far. He hasn't picked a side. Although the Foreign Secretary, when he appeared before our committee in January, did say that Serbia was a proxy state of Russia. So why do people still have this view that Vucic will turn to us when a lot of his actions seem to be directly opposed? And, for example, he often laughs in the face of the EU, saying that his hand is broken, he will never be able to sign an agreement after having promised he would do so, not fulfilling any of the commitments that are made with the EU. I struggle to understand this, but then when I was in Kosovo, and I was kindly given the opportunity to travel as a result of the government of Kosovo extending their hand, but it was quite interesting going to Kosovo Serb areas where meeting with Kosovo Serbs and talking to them, they didn't know that Vučić had ever been the Minister for Propaganda under Milosevic. They didn't know some of the actions that he was taking and what he'd done. So is it a disinformation issue that we seem to be, our ambassadors travel to the region, they travel to Serbia, and then suddenly they believe they have a personal relationship with Vučić and he's not who he appears to be and his actions suggest?
So there are two issues here. Firstly, when we talk about the Western Balkan, it's very much Belgrade-centric.
Yeah.
So as we view Belgrade sort of being a place really important in the Western Balkan, and we sort of want to cozy up because they might cause some sort of instability, and we forget then that there are 5 other countries that are as important, and some of them are NATO members, which are our allies, and we have to build stronger ties. When it comes to Vučić behavior and our links to the ambassadors and so on, you have to understand autocrats, the way that they don't operate like we do in the West. So they very quickly develop personalized relations. And what happens is within our system, we go through the different routes of the system, and some of them do cozy up, some of them start to develop personal ties, and that does cloud somebody's mind. But when it comes to misinformation and disinformation, it's a massive problem in the Western Balkans, and the way that it spins, it's very, very problematic. And that is something that we can work on, perhaps having BBC Albanian service, strengthen the BBC Serbia service to counter some of the disinformation and to try to inform the public, but also allow for that sort of conversation to take place.
And Mr. Cliff, you said interestingly that you didn't think sanctions were appropriate in response to Mr. Smith's question to you. But I'm interested because when I talk to the EU, for example, they say the one thing that Vučić wants to protect is the fact that he gets 60% of all EU funds come to Serbia. So it's not an equal distribution across the Balkans countries. He seems very focused on the financials, and his argument repeatedly is, let me just have the funding, let me get the economy where it needs to be, and then I can turn to the EU and I can turn to a more Western perspective. So surely that is exactly where we should be targeting actions, whether it be in a result to fake elections and elections that were completely broken, or whether it be things like Banska.
Well, I think go back to something I was saying earlier, that although I don't entirely buy the argument Vučić hasn't, chosen which side to be on, I think it's not a given that he is completely in the pocket of Russia and maybe China and forever hostile to the EU. He's playing one off against the other. I wouldn't rule out totally the possibility that if he got a green light or an amber light from the EU, he might start to change his behaviour. I don't want to exaggerate that, because I think Vučić is the kind of autocrat who wouldn't fit very comfortably into the EU, although we've seen one or two other EU leaders who leave quite a lot to be desired. But I don't think that even if there is space possibly to work with Vučić, I don't think we should just be ignoring what happened in Banska. I don't think that's the way to have traction with someone like Vučić. I think, rather like the Russians, the Serbs respect strength. They don't respect weakness or appeasement. So I think we should be taking a tough line with him on those things. But I do think at the same time we shouldn't take it as a given that he is, simply a proxy of Putin. It's more complicated than that.
Thank you. And Lord Robertson, can I ask, the current tensions we see between Kosovo and Serbia, although an entirely different manner or nature of activities, is there anything you draw in terms of comparisons or learnings from the build-up leading up to 1999?
I wouldn't make that comparison. I think Milosevic was a completely different sort of creature to Vučić. And I say, that Ian Cliff is right. These guys are playing every end that they can, and maybe in a Balkan tradition to do with that. But I don't see any ambition by Serbia to drive the ethnic Albanians out of Kosovo, which was the obvious ambition of Milosevic. It seems now to be completely restricted to hobbling Kosovo as an economic entity and keeping the enclave in the north. So I don't think that we could recreate it, and we've got to sort of put ourselves in a different position as well. And I think what Ian has said is right. Being tough with Serbia pays off. You know, these sort of people in this part of the world respect strength.
Have we shown... this is the challenge, is that we talked about green lights, red lights showing strength. I can't think of an example where in the last 4 years while I've been in Parliament we have shown strength or we've given a red light to Serbia. Well,
that's what we need to do. That's, I think, the strong message that you might get, is that we need to be strong. We can be flexible, we can connect, we can engage. We should engage especially with the opposition in Serbia, but we've got to remain absolutely tough. I remember during the Bosnia conflict going to see Sir Fitzroy Maclean, who was, one of the great heroes of the war in the Balkans. So much so that Tito gave him an island as a reward at the end of the war. And I asked for his advice. The advice was wrong, because he said, if you put 100,000 troops into Bosnia, you won't stop the fighting. You'll prevent it for a brief period, then they'll go back to fighting again. In fact, it took 65,000 troops, and we did stop it, and we created the Dayton Agreement after that. But his view was that people were inured to violence in that region, and I think that was over pessimistic, and it has been proved so to be so after that. And as Dr. Hoxhaj said, the Western Balkans is not just Kosovo and Serbia, and it's not just Bosnia. Albania is now a full member of NATO, and so is North Macedonia. Slovenia is part of the European Union and very much a sort of mainstream country. So the Western Balkans has got promise as well as problems. If we know how to handle it well, it can be an area of prosperity, and it can actually multiply security rather than being a permanent drain on it.
I think that's a very pertinent point, and exactly why so many of us feel so passionate about the Western Balkans. Yeah. I should say we were hoping to have Richard Grenell, Trump's former special envoy to the Western Balkans, was due to give evidence to us this afternoon to ensure that we heard the US perspective, but also potentially a view that was very different to your own. Unfortunately, he pulled out on Sunday night ahead of the media reporting that was published on Monday, according to his relationships and interest in Serbia. And before we conclude, just final comments from each of the three of you. What should the UK be doing that is tangible, effective and meaningful, and what should our long-term objectives be in the Western Balkans that we want to achieve? Ian?
I think our long-term objective should be to do everything we can to pull these countries towards Euro-Atlantic integration. I mean, of course, for the moment, Serbia says it doesn't want to join NATO, and Kosovo continues to have the problem that there are 4 non-recognisers in NATO. But I think that's the direction of travel. And as I think we've said earlier, trying to promote prosperity in the region. And as part of that, building relationships between young people across the ethnic divides. I mean, there's nothing very original in that. We were doing it in my time, and some of it's gone back. And sadly, some of the young people we got to work together from the different ethnic sides, what they've ended up doing is coming here. And you're back to this question of migration. So I don't think we should be stopping migration, but trying to create an environment where young and talented people remain. Because another thing is that the people who've left overwhelmingly are the people who've got initiative and get up and go. So there's been a degradation, if you like, of intellectual capital.
Lord Robertson.
Well, I think getting that younger generation to go back to the Western Balkans would be one of the best objectives that we could achieve, because they can contribute to the peace and security as well. But as I say, you've got Slovenia, you've got Croatia, you've got North Macedonia, you've got Montenegro. All of these countries are, and Albania, exemplars of what the Western Balkans could be. And I think a little bit more attention to the the problem areas, and a bit more commitment by this country to them, I think would pay enormous dividends as well. But building prosperity, I think, is one of the key elements. Seeing what their advantage is. Where is it that they have got an economic advantage, and building on that? So trade and economic assistance, using the ERBD, the fact that it is in the UK, is one way of doing it. And using the instruments of soft power that we have uniquely got in the British Council and in the BBC World Service, would be a major ingredient to helping that whole progress, to making them mainstream European countries.
Dr. Hoxhaj.
Just to add to the comments and recommendation of my colleagues, one of the things that we could do more is to help some of the rule of law and law enforcement agencies in the Western Balkans that we feel that are trusted, that can enforce the rule of law. We could share more data with some of these law enforcement agencies and police, especially to prevent any further attack, in particular if we have credible intelligence that something along those lines could happen. Our policy could become a little bit more clear where we stand on the Western Balkan. It's definitely much better to what it was after Brexit, and hosting another Western Balkan summit in the next 2 years might actually be a good idea for us to show our true commitments to the Western Balkan, but could also help for us to rethink our priorities in the region and re-energize our commitment and engagement with this part of Europe.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all ever so much for giving evidence this afternoon. It's very much appreciated. And with that order, I bring the session to a close.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.